In 1845, a mysterious fungus advanced through the fields of Ireland like a silent death sentence. In a matter of weeks, the potato plants on which millions of people depended blackened, withered, and rotted beneath the earth. The smell of decay hung over entire counties. Families who for generations had survived almost exclusively on potatoes suddenly awoke to a brutal reality. There was nothing left to eat. During the next 7 years, nearly 1 million people died of starvation, and another 1 million fled the country on overcrowded ships. Many of them were so unsanitary that some passengers did not reach the other side of the Atlantic alive. It was one of the worst humanitarian tragedies of the 19th century. And at the center of that catastrophe was a seemingly humble crop, an irregular earthy tuber covered in mud that just a century earlier much of Europe did not even want to taste. The potato seemed too common to change history, but it had already sustained empires, fed entire peoples, and revealed an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, civilization depends on what grows silently beneath our feet. But the history of the potato does not begin in Ireland. It begins thousands of years earlier, high above the clouds in the Andes Mountains. About 8 years ago, as written in the original, in what is today southern Peru and Bolivia, wild potatoes grew among rocky toes, cold and wind-whipped soils. At more than 3,600 meters of altitude, they did not look like the soft, golden potatoes we know today. They were small, some the size of a walnut, bitter, hard, and above all, dangerous. Those plants produced solanine and tomatine, toxic compounds capable of causing nausea, vomiting, cramps, and in extreme cases, death. Eating them raw was not a bad culinary idea. It was a real risk to life. The indigenous peoples of those mountains learned that lesson over generations, probably through trial and error, observation, and survival. Every failed attempt left a warning, but every breakthrough opened a new possibility. And then they discovered something extraordinary. If they left the tubers in cold mountain streams for several days, the water washed away some of the toxins. Then, by exposing them to repeated cycles of nocturnal freezing and daytime Andean sun, they managed to further reduce the harmful compounds. It was a slow, patient, and precise process. Even if they did not call it chemistry or genetics, it was accumulated knowledge in their hands, in the memory of families, and in their intimate relationship with an extreme landscape. Over time, they selected the least bitter potatoes, replanted the best ones, and transformed a poisonous plant into a stable food source without laboratories, without modern theories, and without scientific words. They were domesticating the future. The potato, once a hidden threat underground, began to become one of humanity's most powerful agricultural tools. By the time the Inca Empire achieved dominance over much of western South America, around the 15th century, the potato had already become something extraordinary. In the agricultural terraces carved into the steep slopes of the Andes, near Cuzco, and throughout the high provinces, Incan farmers cultivated more than 3,000 different varieties. Some were bright yellow, others deep purple. There were red, white, bluish, and even potatoes so dark they seemed almost black. Their shapes could be round and smooth or twisted, knotty, and strange. Far from the uniform appearance we expect to find in a supermarket today, but that diversity was not decorative. Each variety responded to a specific altitude, a type of soil, a temperature, a humidity, and a specific microclimate. The Incas did not just plant potatoes, they had built a true agricultural science around them. And with that science, They sustained a civilization where others would have seen only a humble crop. They saw a complete system of survival, planning, and power. The potato made it possible to turn difficult mountains into living pantries, and that ability meant the difference between surviving a bad season or watching an entire community collapse. They also solved a problem that would torment European farmers for centuries: storage. A fresh potato rots, and in a world without refrigerators, without modern transportation, and without industrial reserves, that could mean starvation. The Incan answer was chuño, a technique as simple in appearance as it was brilliant in its result. After the harvest, families spread the potatoes on the flat ground of the Andean highlands and let them freeze overnight in the bitter cold. The next morning, when the equatorial sun warmed the mountain, they walked barefoot over the frozen tubers to squeeze out the moisture. That cycle of freezing, stomping, and drying was repeated for several days. In the end, what was left was a light, parle bloc, bone dry, weighing very little, which could be kept for 5, 8, 10 years or even longer without spoiling. Chuño was, in a sense, one of the first processed foods in human history. But more than a curiosity, it was a logistical revolution. It fed Incan armies on long campaigns through the Andes. It sustained entire cities during years of bad harvests and allowed resources to be moved across difficult, vertical, and extreme territory. In an empire crossed by enormous roads, heights, and distances, being able to transport light, durable food was a way of controlling the territory. The potato was so integrated into Incan life that time could be measured by how long it took to cook a pot of potatoes, and distance by the amount of chuño a traveler needed to carry between 2 points. It was not simply food, it was infrastructure. It was security. It was the silent foundation of one of the greatest empires of pre-Columbian America. But those who would end up bringing the potato to the rest of the world understood none of this. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in South America in the 1530s, they were looking for gold and silver, and they found them in enormous quantities. What they barely noticed, much less valued, was that irregular tuber that the conquered peoples ate almost daily. Some Spanish soldiers and administrators took potatoes to the Iberian Peninsula around 1570, but there was no enthusiasm, no celebrations, no royal decrees. They were used as cheap provisions for sailors on long voyages. They were given to hospitals and monasteries as food for the sick and poor, and little else. The Spanish crown, busy counting Incan gold, had no interest in promoting a food associated with peoples it considered inferior. At that time, that indifference seemed a minor decision. But it was not. When the potato finally reached the rest of Europe, between the late 10th century and the early 10th century, as written in the original, it was not received as a gift, but as a suspicion. In many places, the reaction was a mixture of distrust, mockery, and true horror. To understand this, one must look at the mental world of that time. Europeans grew wheat, barley, oats, and rye. They were cereals, noble crops, plants that grew upwards, visible under the sun, symbolically oriented toward the heavens. Bread made from grain was not just food, it was culture, economy, religion, and social order. Village, taxes, feudal rents, and agricultural calendars revolved around cereal fields. The European table, from the peasant hut to the palace, was organized around that sacred idea of bread. The potato, on the other hand, seemed to come from another universe. It grew underground in the dark. Covered in mud, it was irregular, deformed, full of little sprouts that people called eyes, and to make matters worse, it belonged to the same botanical family as belladonna, one of the most feared poisonous plants in Europe. To deeply religious and superstitious societies, that did not sound like a simple botanical classification. It sounded like a warning. If God had wanted men to eat wheat, some said, why would he have hidden the potato under the earth? The rumors spread faster than the crop itself. In certain parts of France, the potato was formally accused of causing leprosy. The Parliament of Besançon even banned its cultivation in 1596, convinced that it spread the disease. In Russia, sectors of the Orthodox Church called it the devil's apple and warned that eating it was a sin. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, it was said to cause gas, uncontrollable desires, scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that caused visible swellings on the neck, and even moral corruption. In Scotland, some Presbyterians refused to eat potatoes because the word did not appear in the Bible. Therefore, they concluded, it could not be a food intended by God for human beings. It may sound absurd today, but these were real arguments, repeated by real clergymen to real communities. For almost 2 centuries after its arrival, the potato remained in Europe as a botanical curiosity. The upper classes grew it in gardens, not in subsistence fields. Its white and violet flowers seemed delicate, even elegant. It is said that Marie Antoinette even wore potato flowers in her hair during events at the French court. Botanical gardens in London, Seville, and Vienna displayed the plant alongside other exotic specimens from the New World. Scholars debated whether the tuber was edible, medicinal, or dangerous. It was admired as a rarity, but not accepted as food. But eating it every day was another story. For a respectable European, feeding on potatoes seemed undignified. At best, they were animal feed. At worst, a sign of desperate poverty. In England, even some poor workers considered it offensive to receive potatoes instead of bread. The class association was clear. Bread represented civilization, the potato, backwardness and misery. Thus, for a long time, this crop remained trapped in a humiliating position, rejected, misunderstood, and growing on the fringes of a Europe where millions were still starving. Surrounded by a solution they were not yet willing to look at. For a time, the potato seemed doomed to remain in that humiliating position. A rejected, misunderstood crop, growing on the margins of European agriculture, while millions of people went hungry all around it. But that situation could not last forever. War changed it. Hunger changed it. And it was also changed by a few stubborn, practical, and in some cases, almost theatrical leaders, who understood something that most refused to see. Under the earth, there was a tool for survival. The first major shift occurred in the Kingdom of Prussia. Frederick II, remembered as Frederick the Great, ruled Prussia between 1740 and 1786, and had a very specific problem. His country was repeatedly dragged into devastating wars against neighboring powers. In those campaigns, enemy armies would burn the Prussian wheat fields to weaken the population and force them to surrender through starvation. Grain was vulnerable. All it took was a torch, a dry field, and a few minutes to destroy months of work. The potato offered a completely different advantage. It grew hidden underground. Protected by the soil, an invading army could march over a potato field without suspecting that just a few inches beneath their boots was enough food to keep a community alive. Frederick immediately saw its military value. In 1756, he issued the Kartoffelbefehl, the so-called potato order, and demanded that Prussian peasants plant it. The threat was brutal. Those who refused could face the punishment of having their ears and noses cut off. But not even fear was enough to overcome the disdain. Many peasants remained convinced that the potato was disgusting, tasteless, and fit only for animals. According to a widely repeated story, the inhabitants of Kolberg went so far as to tell the king that potatoes had no smell or taste, and that not even dogs wanted to eat them. Frederick was not satisfied, but he was more cunning than he seemed. Legend has it that he then changed his strategy. He had a royal potato garden planted on the outskirts of Berlin and posted uniformed soldiers to guard it. The message was obvious, without the need to utter a single word. If the king needed armed guards to protect those plants, they must be valuable. Little by little, peasants began to sneak in at night to steal seed potatoes, and according to the story, that was exactly what Frederick wanted them to do. Not all the details of this anecdote are accepted without debate by historians, but the overall result is clear. In a single generation, the potato went from being a despised crop to becoming a staple food in Prussia and much of northern Germany. Something that sermons and botanical arguments had not achieved. It was accomplished by a combination of military necessity, hunger, and political psychology. Meanwhile, across the border in France, another potato advocate was fighting a similar battle, although with much more style. His name was Antoine Augustin Parmentier. He had been an army pharmacist for the French during the 7 Years' War and was captured by Prussian forces who held him prisoner for 3 years. In captivity, his captors fed him mostly potatoes, day after day, meal after meal. Parmentier ate what many in France still considered dangerous or undignified. And he did not die. He did not contract leprosy. He did not lose his mind or his morals. In fact, he emerged from his captivity in surprisingly acceptable health. Even better than that of many soldiers, fed the usual French military diet. That experience made him deeply question everything his own country believed about the potato. When he returned to France, he decided to dedicate decades of his life to an almost personal mission, to convince the French that this tuber was not a threat, but a solution. Parmentier understood that it was not enough to say the potato was useful. It had to be made desirable. He organized elaborate dinners for Parisian high society, where every dish, from the appetizer to the dessert, was prepared with potatoes. He presented potato flowers to King Louis XVI, who is said to have placed one in his buttonhole and worn it at the palace. He also convinced Marie Antoinette to wear potato flowers in her hair during court events, thereby transforming a despised plant into a fashion accessory. Then he resorted to a maneuver very similar to the one attributed to Frederick. He planted a large field of potatoes in the sandy and infertile plain of Sablons, on the outskirts of Paris. During the day, he posted armed guards to make the place look important. At night, he conveniently removed the watch, allowing curious Parisians to sneak in and steal the plants. In reality, Parmentier was running a public relations campaign for the potato long before that modern concept existed. And it worked. By the end of the 17th century, as written in the original, France finally began to accept the potato as human food. Today, the country still remembers Parmentier, Hachis Parmentier, a kind of meat pie with mashed potatoes, bears his name. There is also a metro station in Paris, a boulevard, and a hospital dedicated to him. Parmentier gave his life to a tuber, and France ended up giving his name back to history. But while France and Prussia slowly began to reconcile with the potato thanks to ingenious campaigns and royal backing, across the English Channel, something very different and much more dangerous was happening. On the island of Ireland, the history of this tuber was about to enter its darkest chapter. During the 17th century, Ireland lived under British rule. Most of the land belonged to English landlords or Protestant Anglo-Irishmen, many of whom resided in England and rarely set foot on the properties from which they collected rent. The majority of the population, made up of Irish Catholic peasants, worked as tenant farmers on tiny plots they did not own and from which they could be evicted at any moment. It was not just poverty. It was a system designed to keep an entire community in dependency. Penal laws had for decades limited what Catholics could inherit, buy, rent, study, or practice as a profession. Thus, generation after generation, families were pushed onto ever smaller, rockier, vetter, and less fertile lands. Many survived on barely 1 or 2 acres, and in that brutal setting, the potato seemed almost tailor-made for desperation. A single acre of potatoes could produce enough food to support a family of 6 for an entire year. No other crop came close to that yield. Where wheat failed, the potato could grow. Where barley suffered from the cold and wet climate, the potato endured. There was no need for a plough, a horse, or a mill. A shovel, some seed tubers, and rain were enough, something Ireland never lacked. For families with no capital, no machinery, and no secure land. That simplicity was not a technical detail. It was the difference between continuing to breathe or disappearing. Furthermore, a family could live on potatoes, buttermilk, and very little else. And surprisingly enough, that diet was reasonably complete. The potato provided carbohydrates, vitamin C, vitamin B9, potassium, and even some protein. The buttermilk added calcium and fat. It was not an abundant or varied diet, but it could sustain life for years. And it did. The population of Ireland grew from about 3 million people in 1700 to more than 8 million by 1840. That astonishing growth was largely possible thanks to the potato. The same crop that protected the poor from daily starvation was also hiding an enormous fragility, because the more Ireland depended on it, the less room there was for failure. Within that dependency lay a catastrophic flaw. Almost all the potatoes in Ireland came from a single variety, the Irish lumper. Farmers did not grow many different kinds. They grew one. That meant that the potato fields in one county were, in genetic terms, practically identical to those in any other county in the country. If a disease managed to kill one plant, it could kill all the plants in Ireland at the same time. There was no genetic diversity to serve as a shield. There was no resistant variety waiting in reserve. There was no backup plan. The food of an entire nation rested on a single genetic line, planted in the same way and harvested at the same time. What seemed like a perfect solution had become, almost without anyone noticing, an agricultural trap. On a national scale, the clock was already ticking. Ireland just could not hear it yet. At the end of the summer of 1845, a ship loaded with potatoes from America docked at a European port. No one could see it. But hidden among those tubers traveled microscopic spores of an organism called Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that thrived precisely in the cool, damp conditions that defined the Irish climate. The disease first advanced through Belgium and the Netherlands, destroying crops in its path. Then it crossed to England and later reached Ireland, precisely the country that had the least margin to withstand a blow. Thus, the effect was almost immediate and absolutely devastating. Plants that looked healthy in the morning appeared black, withered, and rotting by nightfall. Farmers walked into their fields and discovered that entire acres of green leaves that had promised food the day before had overnight turned into a dark, soft, foul-smelling mass. When they exhausted the hope of rescuing anything, they found that the potatoes underground had already turned into rotten pulp. In western areas, in counties like Mayo, Galway, and Clare, the stench was so intense that some people covered their noses and mouths with rags just to be able to breathe. It was not just the loss of a harvest, it was the sudden disappearance of the pantry for millions. The first year was terrible, but what turned a bad harvest into a historical catastrophe was that the Blight returned. It came back in 1846. Even worse. Then it returned in 1847, and again in 1848. Year after year, the potatoes rotted in the ground. Families who had no other real source of food began to die in their homes, on the roads, in the ditches, next to the very fields that could no longer sustain them. Hunger did not arrive alone. It was followed by diseases like typhus, cholera, and dysentery, which ravaged a weakened and malnourished population. Entire villages in the west of Ireland were left empty. Workhouses, built to house a few hundred, ended up cramming in thousands. Behind them, mass graves were opened between 1845 and 1852. Around 1 million Irish died of starvation or the diseases that followed. Another 1 million emigrated, many on ships so overcrowded and diseased that they became known as coffin ships. During the Atlantic crossings, dozens of passengers died, and their bodies were thrown into the sea. In less than a decade, the population of Ireland dropped by approximately 25%, and the country never fully recovered that number. Even today, almost 180 years later, Ireland still has fewer inhabitants than before the famine. The British government's response made the tragedy even more cruel. While Irish families starved to death, Ireland continued to export grain, butter, livestock, and other foods to England. Under armed military escort, relief programs were slow, insufficient, and laden with humiliating conditions. Starving men were forced to perform hard labor, building roads that led nowhere. In exchange for wages too low to buy food, in a market that was becoming increasingly inaccessible, help existed. But it arrived late. It arrived poorly. And often it seemed designed more to punish than to save. Charles Trevelyan, the senior British Treasury official in charge of overseeing famine relief, described the catastrophe as a judgment of God upon a people he considered morally inferior. He also argued that too much help would make the Irish dependent on charity. He did not write those ideas in private, but in official government correspondence. Therefore, the Great Famine cannot be understood only as a natural disaster. It was an agricultural disease turned into a human disaster by political indifference, class prejudice, and deliberate decisions. If the potato had allowed Ireland to grow, the Blight brought it down in the most brutal way imaginable. The consequences of the Great Famine did not stay within Ireland. The 1 million Irish who fled the hunger did not simply disappear into other countries. They changed the places they arrived. Huge waves of Irish immigrants entered the cities of the eastern United States, especially Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. There they found poverty, discrimination, and a very marked anti-Catholic hostility. But they also built neighborhoods, parishes, relief networks, labor unions, and political organizations that would end up influencing American life for more than a century. Others settled in Liverpool, Glasgow, Melbourne, and Toronto. They carried with them memories of starvation, eviction, and loss, but also a deep generational anger against the British government. That memory fueled Irish nationalist movements for decades and would eventually contribute over time to the path toward Ireland's independence in 1922. The Great Famine not only emptied fields and villages, It sowed Irish communities, Irish culture, and Irish grievances throughout the English-speaking world, and the traces of that scattering can still be seen today in surnames, neighborhoods, songs, celebrations, and political loyalties. But here appears a strange part of the story. The famine did not destroy the potato's reputation. On the contrary, it proved to what extent it had become indispensable. The conclusion that many countries drew from Ireland was not that the potato was too dangerous to grow. The real lesson was something else. You must never stake the survival of an entire people on a single genetic variety. You have to plant more types, seek resistance, diversify, and treat agriculture as a living system, not as a blind bet. Following that tragedy, plant breeders in Europe and America began developing new varieties with greater resistance to fight off the infestants. Agricultural scientists promoted seed potato programs to preserve genetic diversity and reduce the risk of a repeated catastrophe. The disaster that almost destroyed Ireland, paradoxically, became the starting point for a new era of scientific potato cultivation. Russia, however, had been fighting its own battles with this tuber. Since before the Irish famine, Catherine the Great had already tried to promote its cultivation in the 1760s, ordering seeds to be distributed to provincial governors throughout the empire. But many Russian peasants reacted with fear and violence. In the 1840s, forced planting campaigns provoked the so-called potato riots. Entire villages rose up against the officials trying to force them to plant the crop. Some peasants burned potato fields and attacked the bureaucrats who promoted them. Even so, the government eventually prevailed between the 1850s and 1860s. A combination of state pressure, agricultural reforms, and everyday hunger finally broke the resistance. Within a few decades, Russian peasants were growing potatoes as a staple food alongside bread. By the early 20th century, Russia was already one of the largest producers in the world, and rural communities had given the potato a revealing nickname, the second bread. That phrase said more than any official decree of the time. The potato had gone from being a foreign suspicion to becoming an extension of the peasant table for millions of families. In China, European merchants and Christian missionaries had introduced the potato during the 10th century, as written in the original. Although for a long time it remained a minor curiosity. That changed when farmers in mountainous inland provinces like Yunnan, Sichuan, and Guizhou discovered that it could grow at altitudes and in soils where rice paddies and wheat fields failed. The potato filled a void that no other crop could occupy. By the mid-20th century, China had already become the largest potato producer on the planet. And in the 21st century, it produced more than 90 million metric tons, a year more than any other nation. India followed a similar path. British colonial officials introduced the potato to the subcontinent in the late 17th century. But for decades, it did not go beyond small experimental plots. When Indian farmers truly adopted it, production grew rapidly. Today, India is the second largest potato producer in the world, and the crop feeds hundreds of millions of people. It is so integrated into Indian cuisine that many people forget it is not native to that region. In Africa, the potato arrived later, but it expanded with surprising speed. Countries in the highlands of East Africa, such as Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Uganda, adopted it during the 20th century and found that it yielded particularly well in hot, cool climates. The United Nations and the FAO have highlighted it as an important tool for fighting hunger and malnutrition in the developing world, and several African countries have created national programs to increase production and improve food security on a global scale. The potato is today the fourth most important food crop on the planet, behind only wheat, rechape, and corn. Every year, more than 300 million metric tons are produced in more than 150 countries. A plant that Europe had despised ended up becoming a silent pillar of the global food supply. The scale of what we do with the potato today would have left an Incan farmer speechless. 2 centième French fries, whose origin is probably found in Belgium or France toward the end of the 17th century, have become a global multi-billion-dollar industry and possibly one of the most popular cooked foods on the planet. What once fit in a mountain basket now moves through supply chains, cold storage rooms, factories, restaurants, and commercial ports. In the United States alone, a person consumes about 50 pounds of frozen potato products a year, mostly in the form of French fries and potato chips, which, according to legend, were born in 1853 when a frustrated chef in Saratoga Springs, New York, cut potatoes into extremely thin slices and fried them until crispy to respond to a difficult customer. Ending up creating another gigantic industry, the average American consumes about 30 pounds of fresh potatoes and another 17 pounds of potato chips every year. McDonald's alone uses more than 30 million pounds of potatoes annually just for its French fries, bought from farms in Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. But reducing the modern history of the potato to fast food would be sticking to the most visible part. This tuber also hides in places almost no one imagines, functioning as an ingredient, raw material, and invisible support for everyday products. Potato starch is used in the manufacture of paper, textile, adhesives, and biodegradable plastics. Vodka, one of the most consumed alcoholic beverages in the world, has traditionally been produced from potatoes in Poland, Scandinavia, and Russia for centuries. During the Second World War, German industrial chemists discovered how to convert potato starch into synthetic rubber for military vehicle tires when the supply of natural rubber from Southeast Asia was cut off by Japanese forces. Potato derivatives also appear in pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, animal feed, and even in the adhesive on the back of some postage stamps. In the end, the potato not only feeds the world, it also helps hold together parts of the industrial world. And in 1995, something happened that would have seemed impossible to those who called it the devil's food. The potato became the first vegetable grown in space. NASA and the University of Wisconsin successfully grew potato plants aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia as part of research for future long-duration missions. If humanity ever establishes permanent colonies on the Moon or Mars, many agricultural scientists believe the potato will be among the first crops planted. It grows in poor, mineral-heavy soils. It produces more calories per acre than any cereal. It requires relatively little water compared to rice. It stores well in difficult conditions and offers a wide variety of essential nutrients. The same qualities that made it indispensable in the Andes 8,000 years ago now make it a serious candidate for feeding human beings off Earth. Stop for a moment to think about it. A crop that the Spanish barely valued, that in France was accused of causing leprosy, that in Russia received the name of the devil's fruit, and that some Scottish clergymen rejected because it did not appear in the Bible, could be one of the first human foods grown on Mars. The potato began as a small poisonous plant, clinging to the rocky slopes above the clouds of South America. Indigenous farmers spent millennia transforming it into something extraordinary. The Incas built an empire on it. The Spanish ignored it. Europe feared and despised it. A Prussian king and a French pharmacist pushed it toward acceptance. It fueled the explosive growth of Ireland. And when it failed, it killed and displaced millions, changing the demographic map of the Atlantic world. It survived its worst catastrophe and ended up becoming one of the most important crops in human history. Present on every inhabited continent, and perhaps soon beyond this planet. Not bad for an irregular tuber that almost nobody wanted. If this story made you look at the potato differently, subscribe to The Origin of Everything. Leave your comment telling us which part surprised you the most, and join us on the next journey to discover how the most common things can hide the most incredible origins. Yes,